Good morning. Committee on Science, Space, and Technology will come to order. Pursuant to notice, the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology meets today to consider the following measure. H.R. 3479, the Natural Hazards Risk Reduction Act of 2011. And that's an important announcement. I have a more important announcement to make, and that is that the ranking member of this committee has a birthday for today. And I've known her a long, long time, and I know now that she's old enough to vote. And I have an 18-year-old granddaughter that warned me last week, Papa, you better be better to me. I'm old enough to vote now, so I'll have to be better to you if you're up of voting age, Eddie. Happy birthday to you. You're a wonderful person, and we wish you a good birthday and many, many more.
Thank you.
Pursuant to Committee Rule 6D and House Rule 11-2H4, House announces that he may postpone further proceedings today on any question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment on which a recorded vote of the yeas or nays are ordered. It's the Chair's intention to provide reasonable notice prior to the commencement of roll votes. Any roll votes will start around noon. And that's about the time we ought to be winding up here. Let's proceed with the markup, beginning with opening statements. I will begin. This is. All right, I'm pleased to call the markup this morning for consideration of H.R. 3479, the Natural Hazards Risk Reduction Act of 2011. The bill we're considering today will reauthorize the activities of the National Earthquake Hazards Reduction Program and the National Windstorm Impact Reduction Program. Both programs are targeted federal research and develop efforts to mitigate the loss of life and property due to earthquake and wind-related hazards. Over the years, the National Earthquake Hazards Reduction Program has been instrumental in developing and advancing earthquake knowledge and raising awareness of earthquake hazards. The National Windstorm Impact Reduction Program has supported activities to improve the understanding of windstorms and their impacts while developing and encouraging the implementation of cost-effective mitigation measures. And I want to thank Representative Biggert and Naugabauer for collaborating on this effort, as well as my fellow co-sponsors, Representative Smith and Palazzo. And we want to truly aid our agencies and instruct them to do that we expect them to do. And what their needs are this year probably is different to what their needs were last year or 10 years ago or 2 years ago. We're in a different day and time, and the tests last year are in the 80s or the 90s, or most of this session is that we be careful as we add on to these bills, the cost of the bills. And we expect the people that are going to have to carry this out to be pleased and work hard with what we're able to get them. I will yield the balance of my time back, and at this time I recognize Mrs. Johnson for her 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hall, and thank you for the recognition of this birthday that'll get me closer to 80 than to 70. Today we are marking up H.R. 3479, the Natural Hazards Risk Reduction Act of 2011. And this bill authorizes two important programs, the National Earthquake Hazards Reduction Program, or the NEHRP, and the National Windstorm Impact Reduction Program, or the NWIRP. It has been a devastating year of natural disasters in this country, and we've experienced one of the deadliest and most destructive tornado seasons in U.S. history. We've had earthquakes in areas that don't usually experience earthquakes, including Virginia and Oklahoma. And Hurricane Irene caused widespread destruction and death along the eastern seaboard. This committee has an important role to play in helping Americans prepare for and recover from tornadoes and other natural disasters by facilitating in the disaster resiliency of communities. By reauthorizing the earthquake and windstorm reduction programs, we can minimize the number of Americans who are harmed or killed by natural disasters, or who have to face the challenge of putting their homes, businesses, and communities back together. These programs both have proven track records in reducing the vulnerability of our communities to natural disasters. They support research and development to better understand earthquakes and windstorms and their impacts. The results of this work have led to advancements in monitoring, the design and construction of infrastructure, and critical lifelines and public awareness and preparation for tornadoes, hurricanes, and earthquakes. Today's bill includes good provisions that I believe are important and will make the programs more efficient and effective. For example, establishing NIST as the lead agency for both programs, improving the coordination of these programs with other federal agencies, and increasing transparency are all positive additions. That being said, there is definitely room for improvement. As an authorizing committee, we require agents to carry out specific activities and have an obligation to authorize the funding that we believe is needed by the agencies to effectively carry out all of what we have required of them. As authorizers, we must ask ourselves how much money an agency truly needs to do every single thing we have asked of it exceedingly well. It is then the responsibility of the Appropriations Committee to weigh various priorities in the context of the current budgetary climate and determine what ultimately should be funded and at what level. Unfortunately, the funding levels in this bill do not seem to align with our responsibilities as an authorizing committee. The bill reduces the authorization level for, what did I say that was, Neeworth, about 36%, and Inworth about 14% when compared to last year the programs were authorized. Further, it constrains both programs by providing flat authorizations and are 6% below current funding. While some may claim that our budgetary situation has changed, the truth is that the need to improve the disaster resiliency of our communities has not. We don't have any reason to believe that these agencies need any less money to carry out these responsibilities than we determined that was necessary last year, the last time we authorized these programs. Yet the bill fails to take a single step to reduce or minimize the obligations of these agencies to justify a reduction in authorized funding. Without a corresponding reduction in responsibilities, we are doing nothing less than setting these agencies up to fail. For these reasons, I believe the authorizations levels in this bill have missed the mark. This is especially true this year when disasters have caused over $45 billion in economic damage and cost hundreds of lives across the country. And we simply can't afford to have these agencies miss further opportunities to implement low-cost mitigation measures prior to the disasters. Studies have shown that for every dollar we invest in mitigation activities through FEMA's pre-disaster mitigation programs, we save $3 to $4 in recovery cost. In the end, strong and effective hazard reduction programs will not only save lives and property, but also provide us with meaningful cost savings. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Without objection, all member statements can be placed in the record at this point. We'll now consider the bill H.R. 3479, the Natural Hazards Risk Reduction Act of 2011. I recognize the gentlelady from Illinois, Mrs. Biggert, to describe her bill. Recognize you, Mrs. Biggert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll start with the bill and then the amendment. I want to thank you for scheduling today's markup, H.R. 3479. The Natural Hazards Risk Reduction Act of 2011 reauthorizes the two important multi-agency programs that address national hazards faced by millions of Americans. The bill will reauthorize two important programs that support research and development to better understand and prepare for earthquakes and windstorms. The National Earthquake Hazard Reduction Program has been instrumental in developing and advancing earthquake knowledge, raising the awareness of both officials and the public to earthquake hazards, and updating seismic building codes. As co-chair of the High Performance Building Caucus, I know how important NEHRP's data and monitoring information as to updating building codes and standards. The NEHRP program recently published the 2010 NEHRP recommended seismic provisions for new buildings and other structures, and provided estimates on the fatality and economic losses anticipated from earthquakes across the nation. The bill includes bipartisan changes to NEHRP program that improves its mission and reduces duplication. Changes include reauthorizing the program for 3 years, further detailing the role of NIST as the lead program agency of NEHRP, and updating the existing advisory committee for NEHRP to offer recommendations and assessments on program development's priorities and coordination. The Natural Hazards Risk Reduction Act of 2011 also reauthorizes the National Windstorm Impact Reduction Program, a program that my colleague, Mr. Neugebauer, first championed in 2004. H.R. 3479 includes improvements to NIWRP. All these names are really hard acronyms. They don't make too much sense to me. But anyway, to strengthen the program, including naming NIST as the lead program agency, which will ensure improved coordination and planning of the agency activities and budget. A strong windstorm program can enable faster development and implementation of codes, standards, and practices to mitigate windstorm damage, protect life, and contain the ever-increasing costs of hurricanes, tornadoes, and other severe windstorms. This research is particularly important due to the exceptionally destructive year that we've had for windstorms. As demonstrated by these two programs, hazard mitigation is a responsibility shared by multiple federal agencies, and to better coordinate a multiple hazard approach to national disasters across the government, H.R. 3479 created a single interagency coordinating committee chaired by NIST, charged with overseeing the planning and coordination of both earthquake and wind hazard programs. The single interagency coordinating committee replaces two separate interagency committees. The American Geophysical Union, the American Society of Civil Engineers, the National Earthquake Hazards Risk Reduction Coalition, and the National Council of Structural Engineers Associations have endorsed H.R. 3479, and I would urge members to support this legislation. Let me just say, while we're talking, as the ranking member talked about the authorization, we did change this from to make it 3 years rather than the 5 years, and I think that the request was for $900 million for 5 years, and this is a 6% reduction for $366 million for 3 years, 2012 through 14. I wish that we could make it more, but in these economic times, I think we're very fortunate to be able to provide the authorization that we have now, where many committees are not able to do so with programs. I would hope, making it 3 years, I would hope we have the economic turnaround that perhaps there will be more in the future. But if we don't keep this when we don't have the money, we can't spend the money that we don't have to be able to reauthorize this for the 3 years and proceed, I think is better than having no authorization at all, which could happen if we don't pass this bill. So with that, I would urge my colleagues to...
Gentlelady yields back. Does anyone else care to comment on the bill for 5 minutes? Okay, without objection, I ask unanimous consent that the bill is considered as read and open to amendment at any point, and that members proceed with amendments in the order listed on the roster, so ordered. Are there any amendments to the bill? First amendment on the roster is a manager's amendment offered by Mrs. Biggert. Clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment number 048, amendment to H.R. 3479, offered by Mrs. Biggert of Illinois.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading without objections. It's so ordered. I recognize the gentlelady for 5 minutes to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment before us makes a number of minor changes that strengthens the Natural Hazards Risk Reduction Act. Briefly, the manager's amendment includes the following provisions. One, it updates NEHRP's progress report to include a description of the post-earthquake investigation activities carried out under the program in order to gather a better understanding of the current system of investigations organized by the United States Geological Survey. Second, it directs the National Science and Technology Council to report on the disaster research, development, and technology transfer activities of the national laboratories, which are complementary to the activities the bill authorizes under NEHRP and NIWRP programs. And third, it modifies the NEHRP strategy plan requirements regarding a description of how the George E. Brown Jr. Network for Earthquake Engineering Simulation and Advanced National Seismic Research and Monitoring System, and I quote, may be used, unquote, increasing flexibility in achieving the programmatic goals and research objectives. I believe that the manager's amendment makes sound improvements to the bill, and I urge the adoption of the measure.
All right. I thank the gentlelady for the amendment. I support the amendment. Is there further discussion of the amendment? All right. Hearing no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment offered by Mrs. Biggert. All in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. Amendment as amended is agreed to. Now the question is on other amendments. For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I offer an amendment that would
I got 'em here.
provide that the programs here for reauthorization would include public education and outreach to different populations, including and especially those individuals and households with special needs, and that also any research for natural hazard preparedness would also include strategies to reach those and help those with special needs. This is similar to an approach that FEMA has taken to help certain populations, those that may be physically disabled, may have barriers, cultural barriers that prevent them from clearly understanding direction, whose proficiency in English may not be at a level to allow them to be prepared and to receive direction in case of an emergency. So I would urge your support.
All right, this amendment's offered by the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Clarke. Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 050, amendment to H.R. 3479, offered by Mr. Clarke of Michigan.
All right, I want to thank the member for this amendment. Is there further discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman,
Chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
I'd like to ask Mr. Clarke a question for the record.
Without objection.
You had suggested that this might help people who do not speak English enough, and this does not require, am I correct, your amendment does not require a bilingual and multilingual presentation by the agencies involved?
It does not expressly require this, correct?
It says that they may and they can consider that a factor, but they are not mandated to do this.
No, this language in this amendment does not mandate that. That's correct.
Thank you very much.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion? Mrs. Johnson, recognize Ms. Johnson for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I support this amendment because it's clear from the evidence that a one-size-fits-all approach to hazards mitigation, education, and outreach is not sufficient to protect most vulnerable members of our population. Most of us have elderly, disabled, chronically ill, or otherwise vulnerable friends, relatives, and constituents who live in areas that experience severe windstorm and earthquakes. And I'm sure we want to be sure that our loved ones and our communities are safe during disasters. As a former nurse, I understand too well how much more difficult it is for many people with special needs to duck and cover or to get to basements or do whatever it is they need to do to be safe during this natural hazard. But they often have to rely on others who know best how to help them. but it's also about what everyone can do to prepare themselves in advance. For example, by having enough water, food, medication in their homes to get them through a week or more when supply lines are cut off. We do have now some warning through our systems that we put together through both NASA and EPA, as well as the the Weather Service, to give us some warning. But we need to alert people as to what they need to be doing during the time that we're anticipating. So this amendment would simply ensure that all of the participating agencies take into account the unique needs of different vulnerable populations and ensure that research about how best to protect these populations in the event of an earthquake or windstorm is incorporated into education and outreach efforts. I thank you very much. You back.
Gentlelady yields back. Are there further? Ms. Biggert,
Mr.
you wish
Chairman.
to be recognized. Gentlelady from Illinois, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I understand the purpose of this amendment, and I think it's very important that we make sure that all individuals have the education that is needed. And my only concern is that this is really just. Do we need to be that specific? Do we need to be that in the legislation itself? I know that we had asked whether report language would be enough with the legislative intent, because it just seems like when you say you're including one group, and there might be other, then people are saying, well, I'm left out, and we're going to have a whole laundry list of various things. For example, what Mr. Rohrbacher said, are we going to have to put in about languages, and the list would continue. Is this language that's used by FEMA in other bills? Do you know, or can you tell me why it's not enough just to have what's in the legislation as such now? And I yield to the gentleman.
Go ahead. She's yielding part of her time to you, Mr. Clarke.
Oh.
Mike won't come on.
No.
Just talk a little louder.
No, yeah.
So FEMA actually uses the term special needs, and the reason why we use it because it's broad enough to avoid that
Tell
type
him
of
up.
laundry listing that the gentlewoman would have a concern about.
Is there something that can be worked out if you withdraw this and work on report language? Are you willing to do that, Ms. Biggert?
I would be willing to do that, but
It's
up to the judge.
It's not a bad amendment. It's a needed amendment. Can you all work out something here and now? You're at two disadvantages, though. One, you're a man, and Miss Biggert's a woman, and two, it's her bill. Yeah, I think so.
Mr. Chair, I think it's so important that, people who are disadvantaged right now do get the type of outreach that's necessary. I'd rather proceed with the bill on a recorded vote.
All right. Does anyone else care to be heard on the bill?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Rohrbacher, gentleman from California.
Respectfully disagreeing with my colleague, I think that this is an appropriate amendment, and quite frankly, we've seen this in many other bills, many other pieces of legislation over the years, where we just want to remind the bureaucracy that, for example, that there are sick and infirmed people out there who need some special consideration, as well as others who mentally ill people and things like that may have to be taken care of during a time of disaster. And just mentioning that to make sure that they know that the bureaucracy knows that we expect them to take care of everybody in these situations, I think that's very appropriate.
Will the gentleman yield?
I certainly will.
No, I'm not made a recommendation here against it. My concern is that whether it's needed or not, if or it's limiting. I'm more concerned whether it's limiting the concept, and if it's not, then I'm fine with having it in the legislation. I just didn't want to be, where we're including.
All right, the
That,
gentleman's
leaving
time
others
has
out.
expired.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Kovac, recognize you. Who seeks recognition? Who was it?
Ms. Edwards.
Ms. Edwards? You. All right. Recognize you for 5 minutes or more.
No, Mr. Chairman, don't be too surprised. I wondered if it would help, though, to clarify. I do support the amendment, but to clarify for Ms. Biggert that in 2006 there was a Department of Homeland Security and Department of Transportation report that actually came to a conclusion based on inadequate response to Hurricane Katrina that a substantial improvement is necessary to integrate people with disabilities in emergency planning and readiness. And then in 2007, FEMA issued a more strident guidance in its planning. And I think that actually begs the question of whether, as a Congress, we need to actually be more directive of the agencies in terms of their response to these unique special needs communities. And I think the language is actually consistent with that and consistent with the direction that the Department of Homeland Security and Transportation and these agencies are going in any case.
Will the gentlelady yield?
Yes.
With that, then I would support the amendment.
Thank you.
Yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Kovacs, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And if I could, I support the amendment, and I just have a question. If my colleague Clarke could answer this question, are the needs of special needs people right now, are they not being addressed under the current legislation or current intent of other programs? And I will yield.
My concern is that in the event of a disaster, we want to make sure that the outreach and research is being conducted to reach out to people that need help.
Okay, and I share that as well. But is it not being addressed now? I'm trying to educate myself.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'll yield to Ms. Edwards.
Thank you. As I was just pointing out, the difficulty is that the needs in these communities actually hasn't been met. And what I was suggesting before is that, in fact, that was recognized both by the Department of Homeland Security, Transportation, and FEMA as an agency, that they were not adequately meeting those needs. And it isn't spelled out in legislation. It's why they've had to come up over some time with some guidance, but they don't really have any direction. And so the point of the amendment, as I understand from Mr. Clarke, is that it would give that directive, and then FEMA, DHS would have sort of much greater responsibility in terms of them and their accountability to us as to whether they're meeting the special needs of these communities in the event of a disaster.
Thank you. With that, then, sir, I speak in favor of this amendment. So.
Gentleman yields back. It seems to me that the gentleman's in pretty good shape with his amendment. Hearing no further discussion, is there further discussion? The vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. All right, the gentleman's amendment is agreed to. Who do we have next? Are there other amendments, and for what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition? Gentlelady.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment that's on the docket.
All right, the next amendment was offered by the gentlelady from California, Ms. Lofgren. Are you all ready to proceed?
I am ready to proceed.
You have an amendment at the desk.
I
Clerk
do.
will report the amendment.
Amendment number 010, amendment to H.R. 3479, offered by Ms. Lofgren of California.
I'd ask unanimous consent that the amendment be considered as read.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment implements the 2008 National Earthquake Hazard Reduction Program Advisory Committee recommendation that NIST be the agency responsible for coordinating post-earthquake investigations. The amendment also provides NIST with the authorization that they would need to carry out this responsibility. In 2004, NIST was given the task of serving as the lead agency and it follows that NIST should be responsible for coordinating all of the program's activities, including post-earthquake investigations. The experts who've testified before this committee praise NIST, and I think we all know NIST as a very efficient agency, and I think everybody agreed that they should take the responsibility of coordinating post-earthquake investigations. And in the last Congress, the House passed in a bipartisan manner, I think the vote was on suspension 335 to 50, the reauthorization that included this change. The hazards bill that is moving through the Senate also includes this change, and I think the original bill that was considered by the subcommittee implemented the advisory committee's recommendation. However, the current matter before us does not include that transfer. Now, California's had its share of earthquakes, and I do understand the importance of NERAP and the work it does to minimize risks and hazards. I think the experts have told us that NIST is the proper agency to serve as lead in the post-earthquake investigations. And I remember quite well in my prior role as a member of the Board of Supervisors in Santa Clara County after the Loma Prieta earthquake, how chaotic the situation is when you have a major event and agencies from everywhere coming in. It is important that this be handled in an efficient and orderly way, and I think the experts have recommended NIST. I think we should listen to their advice, and that's what the amendment does, and I would yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back. Does anyone else care to be heard? Judge, the chair recognizes Ms. Biggert. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the amendment offered by my colleague from California. Unfortunately, because the amendment transfers a responsibility currently conducted by the USGS to NIST without transferring funding.
Would the gentlelady yield? It does, actually.
Well, it does, but the problem that we have is that it adds funding to NIST, leaving the USGS at the same funding level as its fiscal year 2012 request. And I support giving NIST more funding if we are giving it new responsibilities, but I think that the problem that we have is the funding should come from the agency which currently holds this responsibility. And that's a problem, and it's a problem with the Natural Resources Committee, who also has jurisdiction. And from our conversations with our colleagues there, and they do share jurisdiction over the earthquake programs, the transfer of the responsibility from USGS to NIST is problematic to them. And consequently, I'm concerned that the addition of this amendment could potentially slow down the bill's progress and whether we would be able to do it. I'd also like to note that the manager's amendment that I offered today includes a provision seeking more information on the current state of earthquake investigations conducted by USGA. I believe that this provision would be helpful to all stakeholders in order for us to understand how best to proceed on the earthquake investigation coordination and to make sure that I think that the USGS would improve what they've been doing. But again, this is a problem with the authorization of money, and I don't see a way around that. We can't add any more funding to this, and that's my problem. So I would unfortunately oppose the amendment.
Gentlelady yields back. Are there others who seek recognition? Ms. Johnson, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I clearly understand what is being said here about the funding, but the Earthquake Programs Advisory Committee recommended transfer the post-earthquake investigations from USGS to NIST in 2008, consistent with NIST's role as the program's lead agency. And in hearing after hearing, we've heard expert witnesses praise the job NIST has done as lead agency. Further, the experts are in agreement that it is appropriate for NIST to also coordinate post-earthquake investigations under the program. So when we talked to the agencies about making this change in the bipartisan bill passed by the House last Congress, they were supportive of the change. and the bipartisan bill making its way through the Senate right now, which is based on the bipartisan House bill from last Congress, authorizes this transfer. And so this amendment makes the right policy choice by transferring coordination of post-earthquake investigations to NIST and providing NIST with the resources necessary to carry out the responsibility. Unfortunately, even though I believe that my colleagues also believe it is the right policy to transfer the post-earthquake investigations coordination to NIST, they could not accomplish it without taking resources from other agencies who are already struggling to meet their responsibilities on the earthquake program. And so in order to comply with their misguided legislative protocols, I suppose that the Republicans have decided to sacrifice the best policy. This is not the way that we ought to be legislating as authorizing committee. We do not spend money in this committee. We authorize what the Appropriations Committee has the right to spend or recommend be spending. So our top concerns in this committee ought to be policy. And so I support this amendment. Thank you.
Will the gentleman yield?
Back,
Will the gentleman yield?
excuse me.
I yield.
And I understand exactly what you're saying, and maybe the Senate can find more money, but when this program was authorized, it was when we weren't in such dire straits in the economy, and that it was much easier then to say, well, this will be the money. We just don't have it now. And I yield back.
We are not spending in this committee. We are trying to make good policy.
All right, gentlelady's time is
Mr. Chairman,
recognition.
Lynn Woolsey down here.
Ms. Woolsey,
Mr. Chairman,
for
I
5 minutes.
thank you very much, and I certainly support Ms. Lofgren's proposal and amendment, and I would yield my time to her for whatever time she may consume.
I appreciate my colleague from yielding to me. As has been pointed out, there is limited information on the activities being performed under the program's post-earthquake investigation authority, which is being addressed in the manager's amendment. But I think that lack of data and information actually is part of the reason why we should support transferring the coordination of the responsibility to NIST, because NIST has been repeatedly praised by the stakeholder community, experts, NAREP agencies, for being an effective coordinator and manager of the program. And the policy of promoting that is really what we're about. And I think the underlying issue that my colleague from Illinois has addressed really is that in the original Mark committee print, the majority transferred the responsibility and cut funding 13% below fiscal year 2011 funding for U.S. Geological Survey, which promoted a tremendous outcry. And to avoid doing that, the transfer to NIST, which is the right policy, was voided, basically to avoid the reduction in U.S. Geological Survey. That is not a good reason, I think, to not do the right policy. I think we should authorize, as my amendment provides, and let the appropriators struggle with this. But this is it's real money that we're authorizing, but it is real losses that occur in earthquake events. And I speak as a Californian, having been through many earthquakes. The amount being authorized is a very small proportion of the losses that are experienced in a major event, and it's very important that this be done well. And I understand Ms. Biggert's constraints. It's not of her making, but I think that we should adopt this amendment, and I thank the gentlelady for yielding to make that point.
And I yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. I thank Ms. Lofgren also for her amendment, but I do oppose the amendment. I appreciate that it seeks to implement a policy recommendation from the Advisory Committee for the Earthquake Program. It's one that we also are interested in keeping and seeing it come to fruition. As a matter of fact, this transfer was proposed in the committee print that we marked up at subcommittee. And after receiving feedback from various stakeholders, it became apparent that before transferring post-investigation responsibilities to NIST, it would be necessary to gain a better understanding of the current system of investigations. For this reason, I offered an amendment at subcommittee level that switched the investigations back to USGS, the Geological Service, responsibilities. And for other reasons, additionally, this amendment increases the authorization levels by nearly $11 million over 3 years for NIST. And the funding exceeds even what the administration's fiscal year 2012 budget requests. I believe this would be an imprudent increase in federal funding in such fiscally challenging times. This isn't the 80s nor the 90s nor the last few sessions, but the country's at crossroads now, and I think we ought to go along with the President's recommendation. I yield back my time. Does anybody else care to be heard?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. McMurdy, recognize you for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to be supporting the amendment. I live in earthquake country, and basically what you want for your district is the best possible agency to take care of the problem, and that's what this amendment asks. Anyone that would experience this sort of event would want that, and I asked all the members of the committee to consider if you have a major event in your district, do you want the most qualified agency to be taking care of business, or do you want someone else? And the answer in my mind is pretty clear. So I asked the committee to support Ms. Lofgren's amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
Mr. Chairman?
Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, 5 minutes.
Whereas I come from earthquake country as well, I can suggest that, yes, we always know in the back of our mind that there may be an earthquake, but one thing we know for sure, unless we start acting responsibly in our financial affairs, there's going to be a financial earthquake that's going to cause a lot more damage to this country than we could ever imagine. So I agree to oppose this amendment.
Gentleman yield, you base your statement probably on the fact that the funding exceeds administration's fiscal year 2012 budget also. So is there any gentleman yields back. Anyone else care to be heard? If not, hearing no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Those opposed say no.
No.
The amendment's not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, could we have a roll call?
A roll call has been requested. Under the chair's prior announcement, proceedings on this motion will be postponed. Are there any other amendments?
Mr. Chairman,
Who seeks recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Oh, Ms. Woolsey. Amendments offered by the gentlelady from California. You ready to proceed with your amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I am. I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading without objection. Whoops.
Clerk will report. Let the clerk report the amendment first, and then we'll do that.
Amendment 006, amendment to H.R. 3479, offered by Ms. Woolsey of California.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading without objection. It's so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
My amendment brings funding levels for earthquake and windstorm hazards to the exact levels set by the Republican majority in the 2004 reauthorization. I fully support reauthorization of these valuable hazard programs. Of particular importance to me and the community that I represent is the National Earthquake Hazard Reduction Program. Earthquakes are a common occurrence, as we all know, in the San Francisco Bay Area and Marin and Sonoma counties. My two counties are right across the Golden Gate Bridge from San Francisco. Individuals, households, and businesses in our area must be prepared for any earthquake, and we know there will be earthquakes in our lifetime. Unfortunately, Californians know that it is not a question of if, but when the next scale earthquake will happen. The earthquake program has and will continue to improve our understanding of California's risks and vulnerabilities. It is helping us develop mitigation preparedness and response plans. The program makes it more likely that communities will withstand and quickly recover from a massive earthquake. The two programs covered by this bill were last authorized in 2004 under Republican leadership. Now, not one of us can claim with a straight face that the risk from natural hazards or the potential impact of such disasters on our communities has diminished since then. My colleague, Mr. Neubauer, was the sponsor of the windstorm program in 2004, and he is the sponsor of the reauthorization again today. I hope that he agrees with me that the risk of windstorms has not declined since 2004, especially given that this year has been the second deadliest year on record for tornadoes. My colleagues, we should all agree that on the heels of the tragedy in Japan earlier this year, ensuring that our communities can respond to and recover from a large-scale earthquake is as pressing as ever. If that's the case, it is simply inappropriate and irresponsible for us to cut the funding authorizations for these programs. And yet the bill before us this morning does just that. Some may argue that the fiscal climate in 2011 is markedly different than it was when these programs were last authorized, and that we must take drastic measures and make significant sacrifices to reduce our national debt. However, I want to point out that in the year 2004, we experienced the largest deficit since World War II. The budget surpluses from the final years of the Clinton presidency had vanished altogether, and the stage had been set for the fiscal situation we find ourselves in today. Yet, in the midst of that unprecedented and serious fiscal crisis, the Republican majority correctly recognized the value of these programs and saw fit to authorize nearly $192 million for the earthquake program and $25 million for the windstorm program. Now, however, the majority is claiming that its very own numbers are too high and is proposing to cut the authorization for earthquakes by 36% and windstorms by 14%. I must admit that I'm particularly troubled by the proposed 73% cut to FEMA under the earthquake program. FEMA has indicated that under these authorization levels, it will likely end support for its critical infrastructure activities and provide less support for the earthquake state assistance program. In fact, states with high seismic risk, like California, would receive 30% less in funding, and states with medium seismic risks, like those in the new Madrid region of Tennessee, Illinois, Missouri, Kentucky, Arkansas, could have their funding eliminated completely. My amendment proposes to put in place the authorization numbers from the last year each of the programs were authorized. I want to make clear that these are the exact same numbers included by the Republican majority in the 2004 authorization. I believe that by reverting back to 2009 funding levels for the earthquake program and 2008 funding levels for the windstorm program and freezing funding at those levels over the life of this bill, we can help keep spending under control, but also ensure that these agencies have the funding that they need to effectively carry out the responsibilities we have given them. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Lady yields back. Are there others who want to be heard?
But, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Nagelmeyer.
Yeah,
Who
thank
takes
you.
his 5 minutes?
Oh, and I won't take that long, and I appreciate the gentlewoman's comments. And, I would just say is that, we're in a different environment than we were in the previous years. And today, every dollar we spend, we're borrowing 42 cents. And basically what we're doing is we're living a lifestyle today, and we're charging it to our children and our grandchildren. Now, as a brand new grandfather of a little girl, the first girl in the Nagelbauer family in over 80 years, I'm not interested in increasing the gift of the American government any more than what they've already given her. They've given her a note of $50,000. And
she hasn't even had a chance to enjoy any of the privileges of being an American yet. But I understand that this research is important. I still think that good research can be done, but it's going to have to be done at lower levels. And with that, I yield back my time.
Would you yield?
I would yield to the gentlewoman.
Thank you, sir, for, first of all, for your good legislation in 2004, and hopefully for understanding that this is an authorization. It is suggesting to the spending committees what it will cost to carry out these programs effectively. And for your sweet little granddaughter, we have to prevent these serious accidents. And that is going to be, you pay up front or you pay later. And it's going to cost more in the long run. I will yield back.
I reclaim my time and yield back my time. Thank you.
When yields back, Chair recognizes Mr. Miller, gentleman from North Carolina, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support this amendment, not because I don't want to try to do things more frugally. I'm one of the more frugal people on the planet. Just this morning, I ran the shower into the last little bit of my shampoo bottle so I could get it all. But and believe me, there are many things I could tell you like that are. These numbers are simply snatched out of thin air. Yes, it would be nice if we could do all this on 2/3 the money or less. But there's absolutely no evidence, no record, nothing to support the idea. And so Republicans are going to go home and say, look, we protected, we're going to be doing all the same stuff. We told those federal government agencies they've got to be prepared for earthquakes, they've got to be prepared for tornadoes and hurricanes, and we saved 2/3 doing it. And they just snatched the number out of thin air. I chaired the Oversight Subcommittee of this committee for 4 years. And yes, there is waste in federal government. Yes, some of it is because of corruption. More of it is because of just garden variety stupidity. It should be part of the function of Congress to identify that and to do something about it. We have many management tools that are available to us. One is oversight hearings. And once federal government employees understand that there's an oversight subcommittee that really is about the business of trying to make government run more efficiently, they will provide you information. Things will come over the transom that will lead you to identify programs that are not being run well. There's the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, that will help, that will point to what government agencies are being run poorly and how they can be run more effectively. There are inspector generals all throughout government. They can examine how agencies are being run, and they report both to the agency head and to Congress. And none of that has happened with respect to this program. Instead, that we see a number snatched out of thin air and say, do everything you're doing, so we can go home and tell people we protected these programs, but do it for 2/3 of what you're doing. Without any evidence, without any record, without anything to support the idea that the numbers that we've got now are not the right numbers, there simply is not a basis for this change in the law to reduce the authorization by the amounts that are being reduced. So I do support Ms. Woolsey's amendment.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Biggert, gentlelady from Illinois, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The gentleman is talking about the figures that seem to come from the air. Actually, the authorizing figures are the president's request, and we've tried not to go over the president's request, and we haven't gone under it. And so I think that this is something that the agencies have looked at, and I would so I can't support Ms. Woolsey's amendment with when we really have done the reauthorization according to what the president requested. And with that, I would yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes Mrs. Sewell, gentlelady from Alabama.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today I address the committee in support of Representative Woolsey's common sense and life-saving amendment. This amendment strikes a balance, I believe, between fiscal responsibility and strategic investing by restoring the authorization levels for the National Earthquake Hazard Reduction Program and the National Windstorm Impact Reduction Program back to the levels approved by their last authorization. H.R. 3479, as proposed, dramatically undercuts critical disaster prevention activities. This is particularly concerning given the devastating natural disasters observed earlier this year in the United States and worldwide. Both of these programs are important partnerships between government, academia, and the private sector aimed at improving the understanding of windstorms and earthquakes and their impacts. Their main purpose is to provide and encourage and develop implementation of cost-effective mitigation measures to reduce devastating loss of life and property. As you all may know, the 7th Congressional District and other parts of the state of Alabama suffered from tornadoes and heavy storms during the month of April of this year. Homes, churches, schools, businesses, entire communities were destroyed and damaged. Many people in my district lost their lives as well as the lives of their friends and loved ones. It is this type of natural disaster that highlights our need to continue to provide adequate funding for disaster preparedness efforts and to ensure that our first responders are equipped to meet the needs of our communities in these times of great tragedy. The reality is that the need for these types of programs has not changed. In fact, there is now an even greater realization of the importance of these types of programs and initiatives. The best way to minimize the loss of lives and property and the economic impact due to disaster is to invest in pre-disaster mitigation activities. Put simply, the activities and responsibilities we are asking this network of agencies to fulfill has become even more critical and necessary. I believe it is irresponsible and would be costly in the long run to underfund programs that have the potential to minimize property damage and save lives. I understand that in these difficult budgetary times, we must find ways to reduce costs and identify savings wherever possible. However, we must also continue to make strategic investments that will yield tangible results and benefits in the future. I urge my colleagues to support Representative Woolsey's amendment and restore funding levels for these critical, important programs back to the reauthorization level. Thank you, and I yield back to
Would the gentlelady yield?
I will.
I would just like to add my voice in support of the amendment and just reflect back on the my experience in local government after the Loma Prieta earthquake. I remember it so well. It was, around 5 o'clock on a Tuesday, and there were a number of collapses of structures, but nothing collapsed in San Jose. And my college classmate was then the chief science officer for USGS up in Menlo Park. And I remember asking him why nothing had collapsed in downtown San Jose when buildings collapsed in Oakland and in San Francisco and in Santa Cruz. And he said, really, it wasn't anything about the waves of the earthquake. It was just good engineering. It was the information that the city had received to require that buildings be engineered and not fall down. And I look at these authorizations, and it's one building that we would prevent from collapsing. So I think we need a little perspective here on what we're authorizing and what the potential losses are. And it's really a situation of an ounce of prevention is worth many, many pounds of cure. And I thank the gentlelady for yielding and my colleague from California for offering the amendment.
Gentlelady yields back. I recognize myself for just a couple of minutes. We're in different days and times. One of the speakers talked, and all of you made good arguments, but one speaker compared it to 2004. The whole world wasn't trying to go broke in 2004, and that's the direction we're going now. And I recognize that my colleagues on both sides are unhappy with the authorization amount in this bill. I'm not real happy with it. But we didn't cut. We matched the administration's fiscal year 2012 request for the earthquake program, which each agency's prepared and each agency's defended. The bill makes only modest changes to the current programs, carefully ensuring that we're not significantly expanding programs in tight fiscal times and asking agencies to do more with less. We're not doing that. Nevertheless, we believe both are critically important programs in need of reauthorization. The gentlelady's amendment would increase funding for the earthquake program by more than 50% in fiscal 2012 compared to what was spent in 2011. Wind programs increased by 20% when compared to the last authorization. Her total increase is $224.3 million this day and time. I just don't think that's practical. It would be good if we could do that, but to continue the fight for higher funding, especially above the fiscal year 2012 agency request, seems to ignore the financial crisis we're in. We just can't do that. Who across the nation is getting a 50% raise? The amount of the funding is unrealistic in this fiscal environment, and I believe these increases would hamper the chances of these programs even being reauthorized, which I'm sure my Democratic friends would not want. I think we just absolutely have to be cognizant of our current budget environment. Therefore, I oppose the gentlelady's amendment. Who seeks recognition?
Mr.
I yield
Chairman.
back my time. Who seeks recognition?
Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Edwards, Chair recognizes you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I rise in support of the amendment here that offered by Ms. Woolsey. And I think it really is important for us to focus as an authorizing committee on our responsibility to outline what the requirements are to do the work. And we have other colleagues who sit on the Appropriations Committee in another venue whose challenge it will be to match that with what our fiscal responsibilities are in terms of our spending. And, we can't divvy there because otherwise we get away from making good policy. And with that, I'd like to yield the balance of my time to Ms. Woolsey.
Thank you very much for yielding. It's really nice to hear the other side of the aisle supporting the president's budget. We should waller in that. But he isn't. This budget doesn't truly, I believe, represent what he would do, or what he should do. And well, he's not always right. You know what? And in 2004, President Bush was right on this. And
Even if we don't agree with her,
And I'm surprised that when this is exactly the same numbers that came out of the Republican majority in 2004, which was 7 years ago, so that is not a raise over what's going on right now, and when the economy was not in good shape, as it is now, that an ounce of prevention worth a pound of cure is not what we would be using as our guidelines here when we're talking about disasters. We're not talking about frills. We're talking about really important programs. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you for hearing me. Remember, this is a number that is not an increase over 2004. So I think we should go from there. Thank you very much.
Thank the gentlelady. You to yield back. All right, Chair, recognize Mr. Buchan for Indiana for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Being new to Congress, I know fully well we're an authorizing, not appropriating committee, but I would like to point out the appropriated amount of spending for the earthquake program, the NEHRP. In 2009 was $129.4 million, 2010 $131.2 million, and fiscal year 2011 $129.5 million. This bill would authorize $122 million, which is a very, very modest decrease, and is, as it has been pointed out, requested by the president's budget. So even though we have a lot of drama about dramatic cuts and other things, I think it's very important for people to understand, for the American people to understand, that the actual amount of money spent in those years is only slightly more than the current bill is authorizing, and therefore I do not think will result in any significant decrease in the ability of these agencies to function and to protect the American people. And with that, I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Are there others who want to be heard? Well, hearing no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. The noes have it, and the amendment's not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask for a recorded vote.
Gentlelady asked for a recorded vote. The clerk will call the roll.
I thought it was rolled.
Did you ask for a recorded vote?
Well, I want it rolled. I'd like us to have a vote. I thought you were rolling it all to the end of the...
You have the discretion to roll or not roll, whichever vote you
What?
Yeah, I have a discretion, roll or not roll. Looks like you have a lot of people here. And we have a lot.
Yeah, I see what happened.
Which do you want to do?
I'd like to vote at the end of the bill
wanna
like
roll it?
the others are. Yes, please roll it.
All right, we'll roll it.
Thank you.
Fine. Are there other amendments?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
All right. The next amendment's offered by the gentlelady from Maryland, Ms. Edwards, and I know you're ready to proceed with your amendment. Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 007, amendment to H.R. 3479, offered by Ms. Edwards of Maryland.
Okay, I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, it's so ordered. Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I suppose this amendment, in the spirit of Ms. Woolsey's amendment, is, and I can't quote poetry the way the chairman can, but if at first you don't succeed, try again. Mr. Chairman and to Ms. Biggert, at the subcommittee markup of the bill, I offered an amendment to replace the committee print with the text of the bipartisan bill from last Congress. That bipartisan legislation passed the House by a wide margin, a vote of 335 to 50, and it's the legislation that is currently moving through the Senate. At the subcommittee markup, I argued that the text from last Congress was the better starting point for our committee's consideration because it was bipartisan and because it stands a better chance of actually being enacted into law in the near future, and I think that's a goal that we all share. We're at a time also when the American public is looking at us wondering whether it is that we can agree on something. We did agree on something last year. That something is in the Senate this year, and we have an opportunity to come together as a committee in the spirit in which I think this committee has operated in the past to move this legislation forward more expeditiously. But the truth is that much of the policy contained in the bill from last Congress has, in fact, thank you, Ms. Biggert, been incorporated into the bill before us today, either as part of the underlying text or through the bipartisan manager's amendment that Ms. Biggert and I at first offered at the subcommittee markup. I'm very pleased that in this case, and I want to thank Mrs. Biggert and Chairman Quayle for working with us on many of those issues. Unfortunately, the difference that remains between this bill and the bill from last Congress is arguably the most important difference, and that is the funding levels authorized for these important activities. The amendment I'm offering this morning strikes the authorization numbers in the current bill and replaces them with the bipartisan authorization numbers. For NEHRP, the amendment proposes the exact same authorization numbers as those included in the bipartisan bill from last Congress and the bill currently making its way through the Senate. For NWRP, the amendment proposes the bipartisan numbers for the National Science Foundation, NOAA, and FEMA, but maintains the authorization numbers for NIST that are in Ms. Biggert's bill. I agree with my Republican colleagues that NIST requires a higher authorization to accommodate its new responsibility as the program's lead agency. The bill before us today includes authorization levels from NEHRP and NWRP that are not only flat but below current spending. I'm very concerned about lowering the authorization levels for those agencies, especially at the close of a year in which this country has experienced a historic number of disasters. And I think we're all aware of the terrible tragedy that occurred in Japan, an earthquake and ensuing tsunami that devastated parts of Japan and triggered the worst nuclear accident since Chernobyl. This one disaster has so far resulted in over 15,000 lives lost. And moreover, it's quite likely to end up being the costliest natural disaster ever, with estimates exceeding $300 billion. A large earthquake like this one will indeed happen in the United States, and it could happen on the San Andreas Fault in California, and the New Madrid Fault in the Mississippi Valley, or off the coast of the Pacific Northwest. And the devastation that was witnessed in this country this year from tornadoes and other windstorms, including in the district of our colleague Ms. Sewell, is staggering. Tornadoes have caused deaths in 15 states from Louisiana to Massachusetts this year, and in fact 2011 is the deadliest year for tornadoes in the United States in over 80 years, and the second deadliest ever. I think we're all just shocked to know that 552 people have died in tornadoes so far this year in 2011. For these reasons, I can't in good conscience support a cut to the authorization levels for these programs. As we've said before, it will be the job of the appropriators to find the actual funding that's required or the offsets are required for that funding, because that's their duty as appropriators. Our duty and responsibility as authorizers is to set the level that we know to be appropriate for the agencies to do the job that we expect of them and that the American people expect. And as the authorizing committee with jurisdiction over the programs, we should be setting the mark and including the level of funding that we honestly believe these agencies need to fulfill their responsibilities. I doubt anyone on this committee believes that the risk to people and property has gone down. And if that's the case, it's wrong for us to cut the authorization levels for these important natural hazards programs. Mr. Chairman, when we invest in mitigation activities that save lives and money in the future, and when we do more to ensure that our communities are resilient to disasters, we know that that can only be accomplished by providing the programs with authorization levels that allow them to fulfill the responsibilities and objectives that have been outlined in the bill we're considering today. I want to thank you, and I urge my colleagues to support the amendment, and I yield my time.
Gentlelady yields back, and I want to thank her for her amendment. However, I have to point out again that this amendment increases authorization levels for the earthquake and windstorm to levels well above the authorizations currently included in H.R. 3479, well above the fiscal year 2012 agency request and the amount spent in fiscal year 2011 by the program agencies. We made an attempt at responsible reauthorization of the earthquake and windstorm programs. This amendment increases the President's fiscal year 2012 request, implying that the President's proposed level funds were grossly inadequate. And I try to protect that President every chance I get. And here's an opportunity where I respect his recommendations. And actually, Ms. Edwards, you know how fond I am of you and how much I admire your background and your presentations here, but when you tell me it's a bipartisan bill, there's not a Republican sponsor in the Senate, so far as I know. But that doesn't make any difference, but I want the record to reflect what the hard, cold facts are. And this increases, once again, increases $198.6 million. I just think that for these reasons I have to oppose the gentlelady's amendment. Now I recognize Ms. Edwards.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I just want to note that the bill in the Senate actually passed the committee unanimously and was reported out by Ms. Hutchinson.
Anyone else care to be heard?
Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes Mr. Rohrbacher.
So what we're asked to do here is to increase the spending level above what the President's requested by about $200 million. If we are not going to be in a disastrous financial situation, we need to, at least when we're going to increase the level of somewhere, tell us where you might want to cut down. What science programs do you want to reduce by $200 million in order to make sure that our country doesn't go off the financial cliff?
If the gentleman would yield.
I certainly would.
the point here is that we're supposed to be looking at these agencies and their responsibilities and figuring out what it takes for them to meet their responsibilities. Now, we can play a lot of politics, and I'm as good a Democrat as the next one. But whether we have a Democrat in the White House or a Republican in the White House, that doesn't change our responsibility on this committee. And so the fact that even among Democrats that we might disagree with what the president has proposed in his budget is our job as legislators.
Well,
and so I think that looking at these agencies and their responsibilities, in fact, I think my amendment actually strikes a balance between where Ms. Woolsey is and where we are in the committee print. And I would urge us to do that, because what I'd like to see more than anything else is for us to report a bill that gets all of us on board. I think one of these two amendments on this bill, in fact, would do that. And I think the American people would like to see it, and I think it would be good and healthy for us on this committee.
Well, reclaiming my time, yes, you're right what our responsibility is, but that is within the context of the overall responsibility we have to the American people and to the next generation of Americans, that we're not doing something that will cause an overall negative impact on our country to the point that all of these other debates will become meaningless. If we have a collapse of our currency, which is possible when you're going $1.5 trillion into debt every year, all of this will disappear. We will be in a crisis like Greece and everywhere else, and we know it. So that when we actually ask for $200 million more in spending than even the president wants to offer, I think that when you use the word responsibility, it would require us to say, well, here are some examples of $200 million that I'd like to cut out of the science program that aren't as high a priority as this. The ultimate responsibility is setting priorities. That's what we're hired for. That's what we've been elected to do. Set the priorities within the context of what our economy can actually function at, and I don't see either one of these amendments as doing that. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Are there others? Hearing no further discussion, excuse me. Mr. Tonko, recognized for 5 minutes.
Yes, just briefly, Mr. Chairman. I want to add my voice of support to the amendment offered by Representative Edwards. Seeing the record number of tornadoes and earthquakes in some very atypical areas across the country this year draws upon me to be very supportive of the effort made by Representative Edwards. Having witnessed in the 21st Congressional District of New York some tremendous destruction and devastation via Mother Nature this past summer, we're very concerned about having the appropriate authorization so that the agencies can respond in very sensitive and reasonable terms to the American public. I know that there are those who are suggesting that we may be facing a record number of natural disasters that amassed at least $1 billion worth of damage. If we break that record, that tells us that we have to be very, very laser sharp in our focus, which I believe the representative has done here. She's outlined her increases in a very targeted way, and I just want to encourage members of this committee to support Representative Edwards' amendment. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Tonko. You yield back. Chair recognizes Mr. Kravak, gentleman from Minnesota, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And if I could yield to Ms. Biggert, just a couple questions so I understand this process correctly. Do I understand it correctly that these agencies have put forth a number of what it would take to fund their specific agencies? Would that be correct?
Yes, they do, and the agencies, and then that's how the president comes up with his request.
So it's incumbent upon the responsibility of these agencies to put forth a budget that would be able to reflect upon what it would take to do their jobs. So therefore, then it goes up to the process through the president, where the president will there verify their numbers. Is that correct, ma'am?
That's right, and then the Congress has the oversight to reauthorize that and look at their numbers and make a decision.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. So, understanding this correctly, it's incumbent upon the individual.
Now, I must say, just for clarification, the president came forward with the request for the earthquake. At that time, we did not have the wind in this bill, so that was not determined by the president.
Okay, but it is incumbent upon the agencies and to have the responsibilities to ensure that they have the budget necessary to complete their mission.
I'm sorry, would you repeat that?
It's incumbent upon the agencies to make sure that they put forth a budget to complete their mission.
That's correct.
That would be correct. Okay, that's what I needed to know, and I'll yield back. And I would have to speak against this amendment as much as I admire and respect Representative Edwards. Unfortunately, if these numbers actually come forth from the agencies themselves saying that this is what it would take to complete their mission, then I think we should go forward with what the agency is requesting, and I will yield back.
And you further want to support the president's request, right?
We should always support the president, sir.
I agree with you. Thank you. All right. Ms. Edwards has made a good case and has had opportunities. Does anyone else want to be heard? If not, hearing no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. Are there any other amendments?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The next amendment is offered by the gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Lujan. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 003, amendment to H.R. 3479, offered by Mr. Lujan of New Mexico.
I might say to Mr. Lujan now before he gets underway that we think it's a good amendment. We want to let you know that we're going to accept your amendment and appreciate your desire to ensure that NIST conducts research into fires at the wildland-urban interface.
Mr. Chairman, appreciate that very much.
Would you like to go ahead and say the few words?
Quickly, Mr. Chairman, I have a lot of thank yous to share with our friends on the other side of the aisle.
Well, we'll yield you full 5 minutes for that.
Appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. In the Fire Prevention and Control Act of 1974, we charged NIST with supporting fire research to help prevent and control fires. My amendment updates the statute to ensure that NIST continues to conduct research on fires occurring specifically in the wild urban land area. NIST fires research will help us minimize the spread of wildland fires into communities through tools that predict and reduce fire risk, post-fire investigations, improve fire codes and standards, and the safe, effective use of emerging fire technologies. Addressing these research needs is essential if we're going to reduce losses from fire and increase the resiliency of buildings and infrastructure. And this is an urgent and growing hazard. From January through September of this year, we saw more than 7.7 million acres burn across the U.S. This is the fifth worst year on record for wildfires, with the Southwest being hit particularly hard. We'll remember fires that burnt through Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas devastated families that lost entire businesses and their homes. When I offered a similar amendment in the subcommittee, the majority had some concerns, and we agreed to work out a compromise before coming to the full committee. This amendment today is a result of that effort, and I want to thank Ms. Biggert, my friend, Chairman Mr. Quayle, for their support, and for all of the majority staff for their efforts in making sure that we had a chance to work together. Sincerely appreciate that. And I'm happy that we found a way to authorize this important research. So with that, Mr. Chairman, not only thank you to you for allowing me to present this amendment today and for the work that we're able to do together. And with that, I urge adoption of this amendment. Yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Hearing no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Pursuant to Chair's earlier announcement, further proceedings on the postponed questions will resume at noon. The committee stands in recess.
Mr. Chairman, before you do that, may I enter some documents into the record?
Without objection.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to include in the hearing record letters of support for the reauthorization of the National Earthquake Hazards Reduction Program and the National Windstorm Impact Reduction Program from the American Geophysical Union, the American Society of Civil Engineers, and the National Council of Structural Engineers Associations. And with that, I yield back.
Back. What time is it? We can ask unanimous consent to hold the vote right.
What's happening? Are these votes?
Okay. So you're in recess.
We are in recess until noon. And in the Texas legislature, we used to have a guy that set at the clock there when something had to be done by midnight and couldn't be done past that. We had one that moved it back for about 2 hours a lot of times. So we don't have that luxury up here. And we thought we'd be completely through by noon. We perhaps could go ahead with unanimous consent. No, I'm just saying no.
You could come back at 10 of noon.
We need to come back at 10 of noon, I'm told by this lawyer here. You have your folks all out of there. Everybody have their people here. Okay, the unfinished business of the committee is a postponed roll call on the amendment offered by Mrs. Lofgren, amendment number 10. Clerk will call a roll.
Chairman Hall.
No.
Chairman Hall votes no. Mr. Sensenbrenner. Mr. Sensenbrenner votes no. Mr. Smith. Mr. Roybacher. Mr. Roybacher votes no. Mr. Bartlett. Mr. Bartlett votes no. Mr. Lucas. Mr. Lucas votes no. Mrs. Biggert. Mrs. Biggert votes no. Mr. Aiken. Mr. Nagelbauer. Mr. Nagelbauer votes no. Mr. McCall. Mr. McCall votes no. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown votes no. Mrs. Adams. Mrs. Adams votes no. Mr. Quayle. Mr. Quayle votes no. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman votes no. Mr. Ridgel. Mr. Ridgel votes no. Mr. Palazzo. Mr. Palazzo votes no. Mr. Brooks. Mr. Brooks votes no. Mr. Harris. Mr. Harris votes no. Mr. Holtgren.
No.
Mr. Holtgren votes no. Mr. Kravac.
No.
Mr. Kravac votes no. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon votes no. Mr. Benishek. Mr. Benishek votes no. Ms. Johnson. Aye. Ms. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Costello. Ms. Woolsey. Aye. Ms. Woolsey votes aye. Ms. Lofgren. Aye. Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Mr. Miller. Aye. Mr. Miller votes aye. Mr. Lipinski.
Where's Dan?
Ms. Giffords.
I don't know. I haven't seen him.
Ms. Edwards. Aye. Ms. Edwards votes aye. Ms. Fudge. Aye. Ms. Fudge votes aye. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Tonko.
Aye.
Mr. Tonko votes aye. Mr. McNerney.
Yes.
Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Ms. Sewell. Ms. Sewell votes aye. Ms. Wilson. Mr. Clarke. Aye. Mr. Clarke votes aye.
Are there other members who wish to vote? Have all members voted? Any members wish to change their vote? Then the clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, 11 members vote aye and 20 members vote no.
The amendment is not agreed to. Next, the unfinished business committee is on the postponed roll call on the amendment offered by Mrs. Woolsey, amendment number 006. Clerk will call a roll.
Chairman Hall.
No.
Chairman Hall votes no. Mr. Sensenbrenner. Mr. Sensenbrenner votes no. Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith votes no. Mr. Roybacher. Mr. Roybacher votes no. Mr. Bartlett. Mr. Bartlett votes no. Mr. Lucas. Mr. Lucas votes no. Mrs. Biggert? Mrs. Biggert votes no. Mr. Aiken? Mr. Nagelbauer? Mr. Nagelbauer votes no. Mr. McCall? Mr. McCall votes no. Mr. Brown? Mr. Brown votes no. Mrs. Adams? Mrs. Adams votes no. Mr. Quayle? Mr. Quayle votes no. Mr. Fleischman? Mr. Fleischman votes no. Mr. Ridgel? Mr. Ridgel votes no. Mr. Palazzo? Mr. Palazzo votes no. Mr. Brooks? Mr. Brooks votes no. Mr. Harris? Mr. Harris votes no. Mr. Hultgren?
No.
Mr. Hultgren votes no. Mr. Kravac?
No.
Mr. Kravac votes no. Mr. Bouchon? Mr. Bouchon votes no. Mr. Benishek? Mr. Benishek votes no. Ms. Johnson?
Aye.
Ms. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Costello? Mr. Costello votes aye. Ms. Woolsey? Ms. Woolsey votes aye. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Mr. Miller? Mr. Miller votes aye. Mr. Lipinski? Ms. Giffords? Ms. Edwards? Ms. Edwards votes aye. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes aye. Mr. Lujan? Mr. Tonka?
Aye.
Mr. Tonka votes aye. Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Ms. Sewell? Ms. Sewell votes aye. Ms. Wilson? Mr. Clarke? Mr. Clarke votes aye.
Are there other members who wish to vote? Have all members voted? Do any members wish to change their vote? Clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, 12 members vote aye and 21 members vote no.
The amendment is not agreed to. The questions on the House Bill, House Resolution 3479, the Natural Hazards Risk Reduction Act of 2011, as amended. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the chair, in the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. A member requests a roll call vote. What? Why? She wants a roll call.
Do you want a roll call?
Yeah, she asked for a roll call. Clerk will call a roll.
Chairman Hall?
Give her a vote.
Chairman Hall?
Aye.
Chairman Hall votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Sensenbrenner votes aye. Mr. Smith? Mr. Smith votes aye. Mr. Roybacher? Mr. Roybacher votes aye. Mr. Bartlett? Mr. Bartlett votes aye. Mr. Lucas? Mr. Lucas votes aye. Mrs. Biggert? Mrs. Biggert votes aye. Mr. Aiken? Mr. Nagelbauer? Mr. Nagelbauer votes aye. Mr. McCall? Mr. McCall votes aye. Mr. Brown? Mr. Brown votes aye. Mrs. Adams? Mrs. Adams votes aye. Mr. Quayle? Mr. Quayle votes aye. Mr. Fleischman? Mr. Fleischman votes aye. Mr. Ridgel? Mr. Ridgel votes aye. Mr. Palazzo? Mr. Palazzo votes aye. Mr. Brooks? Mr. Brooks votes aye. Mr. Harris? Mr. Harris votes aye. Mr. Hultgren?
Aye.
Mr. Hultgren votes aye. Mr. Kravac?
Aye.
Mr. Kravac votes aye. Mr. Bouchon? Mr. Bouchon votes aye. Mr. Benishek? Mr. Benishek votes aye. Ms. Johnson?
No.
Ms. Johnson votes no. Mr. Costello? Mr. Costello votes no. Ms. Woolsey?
No.
Ms. Woolsey votes no. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes no. Mr. Miller? Mr. Miller votes no. Mr. Lipinski? Ms. Giffords? Ms. Edwards? Ms. Edwards votes no. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Lujan? Mr. Tonko?
No.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Ms. Sewell? Ms. Sewell votes no. Ms. Wilson? Mr. Clarke? No. Mr. Clarke votes no.
Clerk will report to. Are there other members who wish to vote, or any members who wish to change their vote? All right. Clerk shall report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, 21 members vote aye and 12 members vote no.
All right, the bill is agreed to. Now what do we do here?
I recognize myself to offer a motion.
Who do I want to recognize?
You would do it yourself.
motion. I move that the committee report H.R. 3479 as amended to the House with the recommendation that the bill do pass. Furthermore, I move that staff be instructed to prepare the legislative report and make necessary technical and conforming changes, and that the chairman take all necessary steps to bring the bill before the House for consideration. The questions on the motion report the bill. Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. All right, the ayes have it, and the resolution is favorably reported. Without objection, the motion reconsider is laid upon the table. Where do we go? Okay, members will have 2 subsequent calendar days in which to submit supplemental, minority, or additional views on the measure. I move pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 22 of the Rules of the House of Representatives that the committee authorizes the chairman to offer such motions as may be necessary in the House to adopt and pass H.R. 3479, the Natural Hazards Risk Reduction Act of 2011, as amended. Without objection, it's so ordered. This concludes our committee markup. Committee is adjourned. Thank you for your patience.